Good morning and welcome to this Friday's Huessy seminar. We offer 2 to 3 of these deterrent seminars every month, usually at 10 a.m. Eastern. I'm Alex Littlefield, Chief of Staff and Fellow at the National Institute for Deterrent Studies, or NIDS for short. We're happy to have our President, James Petrowski, with us, and of course, our host, Senior Fellow Peter Huessy. Peter Huessy has been hosting these seminars for over 40 years in person, and more recently, they've moved over virtually. NIDS is a 501c3 think tank, and our motto is Think Deterrence. We focus on this one theme, deterrence. Deterrence is another way of saying peace through strength, and we promote the perspective through our weekly podcast, the NIDS View and NIDS Knowledge, our journal Global Security Review, and our NIDS Academy, and virtual events such as this one. Our virtual seminar allows for you to communicate directly to the speaker. You may hit the raise your hand emoji or DM me in the chat if you would like for me to turn on your camera and mic to ask a question directly to our guest speaker. Also, you can place your questions in the chat or the Q&A. We're happy to have with us Professor James Holmes, who's a leading figure of naval history and strategy. I've been listening to his Audible audiobook, A Brief Guide to Maritime Strategy, and recommend that. And now Peter will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Alex, and want to welcome Professor Holmes, who holds the J.C. Wiley Chair at Maritime Strategy at the Naval War College. He also taught at the Georgia School of Public and International Affairs, and he has the distinction of being the last person to fire a battleship, one of those big guns in Gulf War 91, which is probably, that's a great introduction in any teacher or any person. So, Jim, thank you. I'm curious who you hit. I guess it was during Desert Storm. Your book, Red Star Over the Pacific, won the Atlantic Monthly Best Book of the Year in 2010. It was written jointly with a Japanese gentleman. And I'd like to just excerpt one sentence from a book review that I was reading this morning. You write, the book examines Chinese Navy's operational concepts, tactics, and capabilities, and it praises China's missile force. The authors conclude that China now presents a challenge to American strategic position of such magnitude that Washington must compete in earnest. And I referenced just two things. One is the Houthis in the Gulf, the Red Sea and the Suez area have shut down 80% of the commercial ocean-going traffic going to and from Europe. It's increased the cost by 40%, according to Maersk, of shipping a container or a box from one point to another. And an essay appeared recently that pointed out that China was saying to people, we'll let you go through the Suez Canal, we'll let you go through the Red Sea if you agree to join our condominium with respect to ocean-going commerce, and you're going to play by our rules, which are often where they can go, where they can dock, what products they can carry, and so forth. On top of which, Taiwan is very important as well. Is if you control Taiwan, you control the South China Sea. And what's fascinating, in 2035 to 2040, in that neighborhood, that area will have $52 trillion in global GDP and have 5 billion people if you include the Indo-Pacific area, which is India, as well as China. So control over that waterway going from Taiwan south through the Straits of Malacca, through the Indian Ocean, is critical. And as someone who actually had a boss who told me to read Mahan years and years ago, in graduate school at Columbia, we didn't learn about maritime. We had Oliver Lizitzin was one of our professors who was a maritime specialist, but it wasn't big on the agenda. And why I asked Jim to come here is underneath China's growing nuclear umbrella, China, I believe, wishes to expand its reach on the global commons and the oceans and control this for controlling the United States and becoming the hegemon that it wishes to do. Now, I don't know if I'm right or not, but I think that's where they're going. And that's why I asked Professor Holmes to come here and talk to us today. Jim, thank you very much for coming and joining us, and I look forward to your remarks.
Gentlemen, thank you. Let me share real quick, and we will get underway here. Okay, window. Ooh. This is always the hardest part of any talk you give is trying to actually share. Okay, well, it's leaping around on my screen here. Okay, well, let's see what we got. Okay, let me get this rolling, and then off we will go. Yeah, I mean, it's great to be with you all this morning from my secret lair somewhere around the shores of the Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. This has been a kind of an interesting one to try to put together, and I think that's actually to me has been actually quite useful because it's very blurry. The strategic problem, the political problem, is trying to figure out how what is happening in the Red Sea relates to the larger U.S.-China strategic competition, which is all about a virtual war of perceptions in order to deter one another, in order to potentially coerce one another, to reassure friends, allies, and partners, and so forth. How does what is happening between the Houthis and the United States Navy, and to a lesser extent European navies, how does that figure into this overall strategic competition that we see taking shape? I normally like to come down and take a firm position whenever I give a talk or write something, but it's not obvious. This is very much a secondary theater in the larger competition, and China is not a direct player, and so again, I'm going to try to get some traction on this with you, but I hope that I've built in enough substance to fuel the Q&A, which is the really important part of our time together this morning. So with that, why don't I turn right to it? The Clausewitz, you mentioned Mahan. Here's another one of our great seminal strategic theorists, Clausewitz, out of 19th century Prussia, who tells us if you're trying to figure out some strategic problem, the first thing you need to do is understand the nature of the problem. He's writing about war. I would say this applies to peacetime strategic competition as well, and I think he would agree if we could conjure him up from beyond the grave. And he tells us that the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that a statesman or a commander have to make is to try to figure out what kind of war they are embarking on, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something alien to its nature. This is job one when you're getting into an interactive clash of wills with an adversary that's unwilling to bend to your own will. So let's try to do that right up front. Here's the great man, the namesake of my chair at the Naval War College, Admiral J.C. Wiley, who's actually buried about 15 miles in that direction down in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. A lovely man.
Jim, I don't mean to interrupt, but you need to flip the slides.
Oh, I am flipping them. They're not moving?
I don't see them on my screen. I don't know if Alex can see them.
You're sharing the actual PowerPoint presentation instead of the presentation mode screen. So
really?
You can either flip them. Yeah, you can either flip them on the screen, which would be fine, or if you want to, change and share the other side. There we go. That's good.
All right, we'll just run it in this mode. It looked like, oh, thanks for correcting me because it looked fine on my screen. All right, so that's okay. I normally build in animations and whatnot, but I didn't on this one since it's a short one. Okay, so here's it. Like I said, okay, we're trying to get some traction on the nature of the war, the nature of the strategic competition that we are in the Red Sea vis-a-vis the Houthis, obviously Iran, and then of course China being sort of the power behind the throne. We think. That's certainly my read on the whole thing, as Peter suggested in the intro. So this is Admiral Wiley. He tells it. I would describe him. In his short book on military strategy in the 1960s, he basically breaks down strategy or modes of warfare into two major types. One is what I would describe the confrontation in the Red Sea as a cumulative strategy. This is not a strategy that goes from point A to point B to point C until you reach some final destination. That's what he would describe as a sequential strategy. That's what you find particularly on maps of land warfare, such as up at the West Point map room, or pick your favorite place for cartography. Those are sequential strategies. They can be depicted on a map or a nautical chart using continuous vectors pointing towards some final goal. And that's pretty straightforward, as Wiley says, but he points out that there's another way of doing things in warfare. in naval warfare tends to be what he describes as a cumulative strategy, in which battles and engagements are unrelated to one another in time or space. You have lots of small scale engagements going on all over the place, and they tend to grind down an adversary. But again, they are not organized in sequence, pointing towards some final destination. A really easy historical analogy to this would be look up a map online of the Battle of the Atlantic in World War I or World War II. You'll see lots of different submarine and anti-submarine engagements all over the place. But again, it's a very scattershot way of doing strategy. And when I talk about this here at the War College, which I will in a couple of weeks when we come to World War II in the Pacific, it's kind of like when you have your little child. I mean, think about when you're sitting there painting with him or her. What do they want to do with the paint? Do they want to paint? No, they want to dip their fingers in it and flick it everywhere, and that gives you sort of a visual depiction of what a cumulative strategy is like. So there's really not a sequential component in the Red Sea, simply because the Houthis are sort of intermittently cutting loose at shipping, including naval shipping, but also merchant shipping, and that means that there's just not a sequential component leading to victory for one side or to the other. As Peter noted at the outset, the point for the Houthis is to drive up insurance rates such that shipping firms will simply detour around the southern tip of Africa at much higher cost, at much higher wear and tear on ships, higher personnel costs, and all the things that go with much longer voyages. So this is a very cumulative strategy, and therefore, Wiley tells us. Let me go down instead of over. Wiley actually makes a startling claim on behalf of cumulative operations. He says that only sequential operations are decisive in the end. You do cumulative things to help grind down an adversary while you do sequential things, and thus cumulative operations are a difference maker in a sequential campaign. Without that sequential component, this type of campaign ends up being indecisive. The pictures I've thrown on the screen here are of William Eaton. Think about that all the way back to 1804 in the Barbary Wars. Eaton actually led a combined force of U.S. Marines, led by Presley O'Bannon, and also Arab allies against the fortress of Derna in order to disarm, to compel the Barbary states to stop demanding a toll for shipping through the Mediterranean, raiding shipping, and so forth. That was a sequential campaign against something that looks something like the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea. Have seen very little willpower in Washington and allied capitals to do that sort of thing. That does seem to be sort of the final solution if you want to go against a power like the Houthis that is interfering with freedom of the sea, with the ability to use the sea lanes for commerce, for diplomacy, and for military affairs. So I think we're in a rather indecisive situation in the Red Sea. Starting to turn a little bit more to deterrence, which is the main topic of the talk this morning. This is a picture of USS Carney, which I believe undertook about 51 successful engagements against drones and against anti-ship missiles of all types during its 7-month deployment to the Red Sea. We had the Carney crew, the Carney wardroom came over to the War College not long ago, a few weeks ago, gave a wonderful talk. The tacticians did their work magnificently. But you can't really say that the campaign as a whole has been a success, simply because the Houthis remain in place. They don't seem to be all that deterrable, and they continue to cut loose with missiles, drones of all types against shipping. So there's sort of a good news, bad news story for the Navy out of this. The good news is that our anti-air and anti-missile defenses work. That's a wonderful thing, and something that Chinese strategists cannot fail to take note of. But at the same time, it's also become glaringly clear, if the war in Ukraine hadn't already made it clear, that we are engaging at very high cost to ourselves with very scarce munitions against very plentiful and very inexpensive drones, anti-ship cruise and ballistic missiles, surface drones, and even sometimes subsurface drones. This is a cost-benefit ratio that will ultimately be unsustainable over the long haul. It's also draining our very shallow magazines of these munitions that we might need to fight in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, East China Sea, some other battleground in the Western Pacific, which of course is our #1 theater of priority. If you listen to the Defense Department, excuse me, to the Defense Department's statements of purpose over the last three presidencies. So again, there's a good news, bad news aspect to the Navy's performance in this secondary theater. I would to put a little bit more of a theoretical spin on it. This is one of my favorite lesser-known maritime strategists, Edward Lutwack, who's down with you in Washington D.C. over at CSIS, has been for many years. He wrote a wonderful short book that I'm always pushing on my students, even though we don't assign it as reading it at the War College. In 1974, I think it was, he wrote a book called The Political Uses of Sea Power, and it's all about how to do how to use fleets in order to shape opinion among important audiences in peacetime. He says that, I mean, he's talking about basically displaying forces in an impressive manner in order to shape opinion in hostile capitals, in friendly capitals, and of course at home. If you do things well, if you can present yourself as a credible, formidable fighting force, at that point, he says, you cast a shadow across councils in all of these capitals, in particular your adversary, and he calls this armed suasion. So what he means by that is, in essence, that the government of that adversarial state cannot make decisions without taking into account American sea power, Allied sea power, and if we do things successfully, we can shape opinion in favor of our own interests, ideals, and purposes. So that's this is something that when I talk to youngsters, as I did at the Navy Supply School a couple of days ago, I always tell them, man, this is what you all are trying to do on a daily basis by being professional and doing your jobs. You are actually contributing to strategy and political success for the United States, and that means you should really take this seriously. Now he adds a coda to this idea of casting a shadow across foreign councils. The problem he says is, well, a lot of these audiences are not experts in military or naval affairs. He points out that in a peacetime showdown, say the South China Sea today, or off the Senkaku Islands, a lot of time the audiences who judge the outcome of a peacetime engagement, they basically will try to figure out who would have won in wartime. Whoever appears to be the likely victor in wartime tends to win in a peacetime engagement, and thus skew opinion in its favor. And he points out that these are inexpert audiences in many cases, and yet they are the arbiter of the final outcome of one of these peacetime competitions. So that makes actually using military and naval forces to skew opinion kind of a hazardous and an uncertain prospect. But nonetheless, that's the world that we live in, and we just have to try to tune the messages that we send out to these audiences so that they do take on board the messages, and hopefully we will shape opinion in our own favor. So it's just sort of how it is for him, and I think he's right. I mean, having done I'm an old Cold Warrior and Desert Storm veteran. That's what we did day in and day out through port visits, through exercises, and so forth. That's just the nature of maritime strategy in peacetime. So this is simply something to be aware of. He actually gives an interesting, and of course he was writing about the Soviet Navy. He actually gives an interesting example of how this works, or of the sort of the dilemmas and the ambiguities of using sea power as a political level. But he points out that in the late Cold War, the Soviet ships. I mean, even look at the old submarines. You still the Chinese still steam these things around today. They have all their missiles. Prominently displayed on the main deck and above. They have lots of sensors. They're just extremely cool looking. Whereas the U.S. Navy was moving towards Aegis ships, which are not all that impressive looking, even though they're more technologically advanced than their Soviet counterparts. You're also moving towards vertical missile launchers, which are embedded in the deck, and you don't even see the munitions. So, in a sense, the Soviets had an advantage just because their ships looked awesome, and ours did not. So there was a chance that the Soviets would have that advantage, that political advantage, even though they were likely to come up on the short end if we were to actually get into a fight at sea. So again, see, these are some of the ambiguities that go into naval affairs. My favorite, and I'm sure this is true to or familiar to all of you. My favorite definition of deterrence comes from Henry Kissinger in his 1961 book, The Necessity for Choice. Now, in which he says deterrence is basically a multiple of capability, resolve, and belief. our fielding a capability that puts substance into our deterrent threats, the resolve to use it on the part of our political and strategic leadership, and the ability to make our adversary a believer in our capability and our resolve. Kissinger goes out of his way to point out sort of two things. A, he reminds us that this is a product of multiplication and not addition. If any one of these variables is zero, the overall product of multiplication is zero, and thus deterrence is zero. That makes deterrence a very blurry process. It's an interactive process, and again, it's an interactive war for perception, sort of a virtual war in peacetime. Now, I bracketed, in recent months, I've taken to slightly amending Kissinger's formula, simply because I've seen this with my own eyes. Adding competence seems to be an important variable as well. You can make the case that that's part of capability, and I think that's sort of what Kissinger assumes. But to me, it seems like I think it's actually co-equal with capability and resolve. And the reason I say that is, I mean, think about the events that have beset, that bedeviled the United States Navy in recent years. Collisions, a spate of collisions in 2017, alongside another couple of incidents also in the Western Pacific that year. A major amphibious warship burning to the waterline in San Diego, in its own home port, in full view of everybody both in San Diego and around the world. I mean, these are images that undermine faith on the part of our allies, partners, and friends, but also on the part of our adversaries in our ability to use our capability, even if we have all the resolve in the world. That's gonna cast doubt on the belief variable. The target audiences for deterrence, reassurance, or coercion. If they come to doubt that we can use our capabilities well, at that point there's going to be doubt in their minds about our ability to keep our commitments to them, or to deter them in the case of our adversaries when the chips are down. So I tend to break out even pictures of rusty ships. We used to mock the Soviet Navy back in the 1980s when I came on active duty, because their ships were so slovenly. The point being, if you can't even be bothered to keep rust off your ship and keep everything ship shape, how well are you going to fight and do really important things if you don't do the little things well? These sort of images have started to crop up on the internet, even with regard to our frontline Aegis destroyers, which I'll show you just one here in a minute. So this logic applies both to deterrence. I'm not going to talk about coercion this much, but I think that Kissinger doesn't extend this formula to coercion. But I think Thomas Schelling and others would, and I certainly would, as well as reassurance of, again, giving heart to friends, allies, and partners is a big part of this strategic competition as well. If they can have confidence that we will be there for them when we say we will. At that point, we've firmed up our alliances, partnerships, and friendships. So, competence, capability, resolve, and belief. These are really the variables that I'll spend the next few minutes talking about the Red Sea on. And so, I kind of got ahead of myself. Yeah, why competence? Well, I mean, it's just to give one more bit of backing for this. This is Admiral Bradley Fisk from a century ago, who wrote a wonderful book called the Navy as a Fighting Machine. And he was a sort of technician, but one point he makes in the course of talking about wargaming and all the issues that he gets into in that excellent book is, he just points out that the finest weapon, the finest widget is no better than the person wielding it. You can hand the finest warship to an incompetent crew, and they're not going to be able to extract maximum design performance out of it. And at that point, the weapon is simply not all that effective. And it's not going to have much deterrent, coercive, or reassurance effects on target audiences. So, turning more specifically to deterrence in the Red Sea, let's first look at the United States. Are we deterring China in the Red Sea? The capability aspect. Well, I mean, here's a picture of the Carney again, as I foreshadowed a minute ago. Our stuff works as designed. We've done well, and this is a very demanding tactical environment in the Red Sea. There's a lot of surface clutter. There's a lot of the atmospheric. There's a lot of atmospheric layering. It's simply a very difficult radar environment, and also a difficult command and control environment. And yet, it has worked. We have not taken any hits, or the Navy has not taken any hits in pushing 10 months of combat at this point. which is obviously a good thing. We did have a missile get very close to USS Gravely, so that they got to within a mile of Gravely. Never have figured out whether the watch team on that did that deliberately. I can't imagine that they would have, but they ended up engaging it with the close-in weapon system, basically the Gatling gun that engages targets really as a method of last resort. So not many captains would be willing to let a missile deliberately come within a mile of the ship. But that's it. But in any event, don't know what the inside story was, but that was certainly a bit hair raising. So our stuff works. Our naval aviation has done well engaging drones. So this is an F-18 coming off of a USS Dwight D. Eisenhower during that ship's deployment to the Red Sea. So in that sense, the capability variable, I think this is something that would give pause to decision makers in Beijing, to strategists, operational planners, and whatnot in Beijing, that we are still a credible fighting force, even apart from all the maladies that I just listed for you. So I think we're doing okay in the capability realm. Would be my guess. What about the competence variable? Well, here's one of those pictures that I was talking about. Look, I mean, this is one of our Aegis destroyers. Look at the main deck. That is a travesty. It's basically just one large mass of rust surrounding the vertical launchers and after the 5-inch gun mount there. This is something that I mean. Thankfully, I think that the Navy is actually doing better, being attuned to the political effects of images such as this. That we're doing better maintaining our ships, or at least keeping such images off the internet where they really do our reputation harm. But nonetheless, this is something that would really potentially undercut deterrence vis-a-vis China, simply because they'll do what we did to the Soviet Navy and really come to doubt our major adversary's capability to actually fight and win, to use its hardware in a decisive manner, in combat. I think this is either the USS. I think this is USS McCain after its collision in the Western Pacific back in 2017. I say that because I believe Fitzgerald took that major hit on its starboard side, and the starboard side of this one looked pretty good. But in any event, one of our destroyers that underwent basically a failure of basic seamanship and navigation and piloting, it was unable to keep from running into a merchant ship. Just something that should never happen in the world's dominant Navy. So this is something that would damage images of competence. I would actually, excuse me, I'm getting a little bit outside the Red Sea, but I think since we're talking about the overall U.S.-China competition, I think it actually works. I mean, think about the messages that we're sending by our inability to bring in any warship program on budget and on time. This is a short piece I did a couple of weeks ago on the Constellation class frigate program. This was the shipbuilding program that was supposed to make everything better. We were going to pick a parent design out of a European Navy, which we did, and then we were going to just basically plop our own sensors and weapons on it, and we were going to put them into mass production. Come to find, and the GAO and different Congressional Research Service and so forth have documented the Navy's made over 500 changes to that hull to the extent that rather than being about 85% common with the parent design, the Frem frigate out of Italy and France, now it has only about 15% commonality with the parent design, with the extent that to the point that it's now at least 3 years behind schedule. It's over budget. This, I mean, think about what we're talking about. We know that China puts out. I mean, they're cranking out warships like sausages at various shipyards around the China coast. We just don't seem to be able to do it over the last 20 years or thereabouts. We've had some successes like with the Virginia class submarine, and I guess we're starting to get value out of the Ford class carrier and the 3 Zumwalt destroyers, but nobody would represent those programs as examples of U.S. maritime competence, let alone supremacy. So I think that these basic the apparent inability of the United States to do the basic blocking and tackling of being a sea power. This is something that really cuts into deterrence, coercion, and reassurance overseas. As far as resolve goes, I think this is a debate we can have. I don't think it seems unclear to me, especially given all the dislocation in the White House right now with President Biden's mental, his mental state and so forth. It's really kind of hard to estimate U.S. resolve to deter China in the Red Sea. So something that we can debate during the Q&A. Oh, pardon me. We're having fall pollen season here, and I am under attack. The just to close out this part of the talk, I would just point back to Malone back in the old Untouchables movie, in which he asks Elliot Ness, "What are you prepared to do about this problem?" namely Al Capone, and we really haven't seen the resolve to do anything decisive about the Houthis as far as taking more direct action, whether it's heavier airstrikes or putting forces ashore to go and solve the problem at its root. We simply don't seem to have the resolve to do what it takes, and I think that cuts into overall deterrence vis-a-vis China. Are we signaling that we are unwilling to go ashore in the Western Pacific, wherever the case may be, wherever the fight happens? And so I think U.S. deterrence in that sense is probably suffering in the Red Sea simply because of that, simply because of these competence and also because of this resolve variable. As far as belief, I think we'll have to ask Xi Jinping. He seems like a pretty savvy character. He seems like he is an adult as far as I can tell. He seems pretty cautious and prudent and so forth. So I think the answer, are we deterring China in the Red Sea, I think is again kind of a mixed bag. I will say just as a mea culpa that I also thought Vladimir Putin was also pretty cautious and prudent as well until February 2022 when he pulled the trigger in Ukraine. So these are, I mean, sinology, criminology are also always things that we're trying to get our minds around as far as trying to parse out motives and views in authoritarian societies. Flip it around. We can also ask the question: to what extent is China deterring the United States and its partners in the Red Sea as far as capability? Well, we know that China is not a direct player in the Red Sea. It's the PLA Navy has not shown up. They're not doing direct anti-access and area denial stuff in order to contribute to the Houthis' cause. Nonetheless, I would say there is a display of capability descended from China's inventory, which has made its way via Iran to the Houthis and into the Red Sea. We've been speculating about anti-ship ballistic missiles for a very, very long period of time. In particular, China's DF-21D, the shorter range variant, and also the DF-26, which has a range apparently, if they can close the kill chain, of about 2,000 nautical miles off of China's coastlines. With apologies, don't mean to insult the Houthi military-industrial complex, but I sort of doubt they have developed anti-ship ballistic missiles, a family of anti-ship ballistic missiles on their own. It seems pretty clear to me that China has shared that technology with Iran, and we know that Iran has shared it with the Houthis, and thus we've actually seen the display, the actual combat use of this new form of anti-ship munition in the Red Sea, and it seems to have worked. We have shown our ability to shoot these things down. They have shown their ability to use them certainly against unarmed shipping and potentially even against naval shipping to good effect from their standpoint. So in that sense, we now must be convinced, if we weren't already, that China's inventory of anti-ship ballistic missiles is a growing concern and something that we cannot disregard in the Western Pacific. So in that case, this is almost a test case for this Chinese capability, and something that cannot but help shape perceptions here in the West about the likely outcome of the U.S.-China war and how we should fight that thing. Here's Peter mentioned the nuclear dimension, which I will just very briefly as well. And I'm not exactly how sure the degree to which the nuclear dimension plays into the sea confrontation, but certainly this is this map out of CSIS, the missiles of China page. I've depicted the two range arcs for the DF-21D and the DF-26. These are missiles that can lash out at moving shipping at sea, hundreds if not thousands of miles away from Chinese shores without China even sending a ship to sea or an airplane into the air. There's a lot of geography overshadowed by China's conventional missile inventory, especially for land targets and ships within this envelope. Unfortunately, it's a little bit. It doesn't really fade out. The Red Sea itself is right on the edge of the DF-26's firing range arc. so it's not a this is not a direct Chinese deterrent in the Red Sea. Although these are mobile vessels. If China should get permission from one of its regional partners to forward deploy batteries of anti-ship ballistic missiles to the region, at that point it will have added another layer or another rung to its escalation ladder, and broadened its options in South Asia as well. So something to watch for is the conventional deterrent aspect of China's anti-access and area denial capability that it's fielded in the Western Pacific. We know, and we can talk about it. This is the Q&A. I do not represent myself as an expert on China's nuclear strategy, but we do know that China has been on a building spree with nuclear missile silos, and these obviously have the reach to strike in the Red Sea should China's leadership see the need to do so. So we're watching China build up towards about a 1,000 warhead inventory by about 2030, and so this is always something you cannot escape factoring into perceptions of deterrence, coercion, and reassurance. This is actually something that Toshi, my co-author, and I we did this volume at Stanford University Press Georgetown University Press about 12 years ago. And we were riffing on Paul Bracken's ideas about the second nuclear age. I think this is just part and parcel of the second nuclear age, an age of more nuclear powers and situated in close proximity to one another on the map, and varying incentives and capabilities to actually use nuclear weapons. So, in a sense, we represented the second nuclear age, a time in which nuclear use is more likely, even if it's probably less catastrophic. So it feels like the Red Sea might fit into that template as well. As far as competence, is China mounting a credible display of competence? Well, I think so. And again, we're extrapolating from what we've seen in the Western Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and especially in the Western Indian Ocean, where China has mounted a counter-piracy expedition ever since late 2008, and seems to have comported itself in a very competent and professional manner. As far as I can tell from talking to our students and people I talk to in the Navy world, they seem rather impressed with the PLA Navy as a fighting force. Yes, they do things like confront the Philippine Coast Guard and do all sorts of foolishness, but it feels like they discharge their missions as the leadership expects them to in Beijing. So I think that, competence-wise, I think the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has acquitted itself rather well. This is a picture of the Chinese facility in Djibouti, which is extremely impressive looking. Here you go. And a picture is worth 1,000 words. This actually to me conveys competence, as do photos of Chinese ships. You never see rusty vessels. They're either good at managing the visuals, or else they do other things to avoid looking incompetent at how they handle their ships. This is the latest Chinese carrier, Fujian, which I believe is out doing sea trials right now. Their first conventional launch and arrested recover carrier. Pretty impressive looking thing. And again, it's just amazing what they are doing in the realm of sea power over the last quarter century or thereabouts. I mean, I talked about our shipbuilding woes. This is a picture off of Twitter about a month ago, depicting 13 ships of war under construction at a single shipyard outside of Shanghai. And just an incredible thing. And it's the rate of production is something that we simply cannot match. In fact, our Navy is now shrinking at a time when we've been talking for years and years about growing it, about making the fleet larger. The Navy is now talking about idling 17 ships, 17 merchant ships, logistic ships, and so forth, simply because we don't have the civilian mariners to man them. And that's again, when you talk about relative perceptions of competence, this looks like competence. I'm not entirely sure the news out of our own maritime sector actually reinforces that. And in fact, here's just an image from our, and this relates to something Peter opened with. This is an image out of Commander Salamander, one of our anonymous Navy commentators, retired Navy commander, pointing out that the Chinese have very effectively related, probably via Iran, but certainly they have communicated to the Houthis that their Chinese merchant ships will be able to use the Red Sea sea lanes in order to access the Suez Canal and carry on trade at lower cost than China's shipping competitors. There was one incident in which a Chinese vessel was struck. Apparently, Xi Jinping and his lieutenants took the Houthis to the woodshed and instructed them that China would be able to they would forbear from any attacks on Chinese merchant ships, and there haven't been any more. So 1 out of 83 attacks has been on a Chinese vessel, but not for a very long period of time. So this grants it a competitive advantage to China at a time in which the Chinese economy seems to be faltering, and thus that's something that figures into this overall deterrent coercive and reassurance calculus in the Red Sea, and so it's certainly something to be mindful of. And lastly, as I wind down here, has China mounted a show of resolve that would contribute to deterrence in the Red Sea, but also in the overall U.S.-China strategic competition. And that's it. Again, this is something we can only debate by trying to figure out by parsing speeches and whatnot that come out of Beijing from Xi Jinping's lieutenants, from what he does as far as relations with the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese people. And again, this is just trying to parse the words and actions of an authoritarian leader is a suspect thing is best, but there's really no substitute for making the answers. So I don't. So again, but he seems like a pretty resolute guy to me. I've seen very little. I've seen very little indication that he's going to swerve from his ideas, like the China dream, China's ability to essentially shake off a century of humiliation and make itself a force to be reckoned with. Certainly as Asia's leading power, but also a force to be reckoned with on the world stage as well. So yeah, he seems like somebody who does not swerve from what he says. He's also put himself on the hook with the Chinese people to deliver all the things that he has repeatedly and stridently promised to them for the last 12 years since he took power. So again, it seems to be the character of the man, and also simply the fact that he's promised these things repeatedly really paints him in a corner. He really has a hard time backing down from what he's promised to deliver by the centennial of the founding of the PRC in 1949. And lastly, belief. This is something that, again, I think that American politics is really in upheaval. It would be anyway during an election year, but this one just feels like just an even odder election year. Exactly how do you reckon U.S. belief in order to do things in the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, or the wider and Western Pacific? And I don't know. I think it's a fascinating discussion, but at this point, I think why don't I close just to remind us of our great theoreticians. What would Kissinger say about this? What would Lutwak say about it? What would Admiral Wiley say about it? And so, like I said, this is sort of a wishy-washy presentation by my standards, but these to me seem to be the important issues and the important questions that we all need to be grappling with in the coming months and years. And with that, I'm going to wet my whistle, stop sharing, and look forward to fielding whatever questions you would like to pose.
Well, Jim, thank you.
Back over to you.
Thank you, sir. That was extraordinary. It's just what the doctor ordered. I'm going to go to one of your original fascinating look at the difference between sequential acts and just random. And the question is, what do you see the Houthis in China and Iran doing next? Because I think this is all part of a pattern. They call it unrestricted warfare. But what should we be looking for down the road? And second part of the question is, what do we and our allies in the region do about it? Now, again, this is speculative, but there's nothing wrong with looking out over the future, as of Army General said, looking around the corner of history, which is what you're doing. And we're just trying to figure it out.
Yeah, people are always saying that what we do is speculative. I think it's baked into it. We're talking about trying to project the future, and what Clausewitz basically says is a fractal environment. He talks about war and politics branching off in all different directions, so that the best you can accomplish is in the finite nature of a synthesis. And in fact, here's a fun fact about Clausewitz. He's known as the father of complexity theory in mathematics. This kind of an interesting tie back from mathematics to the 1830s Prussia. but yeah, it's a what I mean. So what should we expect next? I think I think one litmus. I mean, one thing to look at would be. I mean, does China? I mean, if we were successfully deterring China in the Red Sea, if we were sort of making a contribution to the overall competition in the Red Sea, you might actually see China take a more circumspect approach to the South China Sea, where it's trying to essentially assert sovereignty over the vast majority of the body of water, which means the right to rule within the 9- or 10- line. It's basically so to overstate it slightly. It's about state ownership of territory, which is not subject to a state ownership to sovereignty under the law of the sea, to which China assented many years ago, but seems to want to airbrush out. We know that China's Coast Guard and maritime militia have been extremely aggressive towards the Philippines, in particular, in recent months. And then the PLA Navy has been there in support, and ashore the PLA Air Force and the Strategic Rocket Force. Does China actually show signs that it is being not face down, but deterred by what we're doing in the Red Sea? If we look at its behavior elsewhere in East Asia, is its Coast Guard being more circumspect in the waters around the Senkaku Islands, where it is essentially asserted joint administrative control of those waters, which belong to Japan, but China would like back? So I mean, again, I don't think you'll see any clear indications that there's sort of a ripple effect from West Asia to East Asia, but those would sort of be some markers to look at. Beijing has been on the ground or at sea, down on the tactical and operational levels. They have been very aggressive, as I said. They're now at least talking. They're at least talking with the Philippines, talking with the United States again. And so I don't know whether that actually translates into any strategic gains on our part, but these would be sort of the litmus tests that I would look at in order to try to figure out what's happening. If they are not deterred, I think you could expect to see a more forceful, say, Iranian strategy in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Gulf. I mean, Iran seems to be sort of the go between China and the Houthis. This is really it's really a dangerous time that we're at. If you read in another book that I'm always pushing on our students, and we love Nicholas Spikeman's old book, Geography of the Peace, and the related volume, America's Strategy of World Politics, from back during World War II. But he points out that if you're a globe-spanning maritime hegemon like the United States today, or Great Britain back in its heyday, or the Netherlands before that, or Spain or Portugal, you cannot shape events in the rimlands, important rimlands, where you would like to trade, where you would like to do diplomacy and military things, such as East Asia or Western Europe, or today South Asia. If you can't actually get to the rimlands, you really can't do much. If that dominant navy cannot take command of the waters adjoining the rimlands, at that point you've undone its maritime strategy, and you've really sort of shouldered it out of what it needs to do in order to accomplish its goals. We want to trade in Eurasia. We would like to pursue a balancing strategy in Eurasia. We really can't do that. So if China can keep us out, if Iran can keep us out, Russia, whoever the case may be. And at that point, you've also undone the U.S. alliance system as well, which is huge. We have no strategic position in the Western Pacific or Europe or anywhere else without our alliances. And that's something that I think we tend to lose sight of. I mean, where are we if we lose the Japanese alliance and the South Korea or whatnot? We're back at Guam. You can't really mount dominant offensive operations in a superpower's backyard from Guam. It's just not going to happen. Carrier air forces are not going to do it. I mean, it simply can't be done. So I think in Spikeman's terms, there's a concerted effort. Don't know to what extent there's a command and control relationship among the hostile powers, but there certainly seems to be a lot of opportunism going on at the very least. And I think Spikeman would instantly recognize what's going on.
Let me ask you to do one thing, and I'm going to go to the other questions that are now in the chat room. Is what do you mean by I know what you mean, but others might. What do you mean by the rimlands?
Yeah. Well, there's sort of two ways to think about the rimlands. One is as trading regions, places where, Mahan, whom you mentioned at the outset, Mahan tells us that the heart of sea power is trade, the propensity to trade overseas, so that you make yourself wealthy with all the blessings that brings. you can afford a military and naval protector for trade and so forth. So there's the commerce is king for Mahan. The other aspect is what we call offshore balancing. If you talk to John Mearsheimer and people like that, the idea that we should try to keep a hostile single power or alliance from dominating one of the rim lands, sort of these interfaces between the heartland and the sea. If you don't want to allow a Nazi Germany or an Imperial Japan or anybody else to basically take control of these coastal expanses, unify the resources that available there, and thus constitute a threat to the Western Hemisphere. So that's the basic idea behind offshore balancing. But yeah, the rim. If you look at Geography of the Peace, which is available on the Internet Archive, if anybody hasn't read it and wants to, so you can get a freebie copy. But he goes back to Mackinder and so forth, and basically has a debate with Mackinder about the heartland, the importance of the heartland of Eurasia as opposed to the rim lands. Certainly East Asia, China and East Asia. That's one of the rim lands. Western Europe, a key one, obviously, a peninsula jutting out of Eurasia, and then obviously South Asia today. South Asia was sort of a backwater in Spikeman's day, but no longer now with the rise of India.
I'd like to turn it over to our president, Jim Petrosky. Jim, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And Jim, there's a lot to digest in here. I'm looking forward to going back and
Yes.
seeing this again.
There is a lot.
Yeah, so I just want to know, how effective is our U.S. extended deterrence in reducing China's aggressive activities at sea? Where does that play a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably hinted at this. I think nuclear deterrence seems to be. I mean, we obviously are at a point where we need to redo our own nuclear deterrent, building the Columbia class submarines, which I can almost see. I can almost see Quonset Point from here in my office. I mean, that's happening here in southern. I mean, the Ohio class of the late Cold War in the 1990s is aging out of service. So with the undersea nuclear deterrent, the really key aspect of U.S. deterrence, if you ask me, is undergoing a refresh. It's also behind schedule. I mean, this is another. The Navy has said this program is number one. It's by far it's our number one priority, and it must remain on schedule. Well, it's now behind schedule, so the Navy is thinking about trying to figure out how to do a brief life expansion on the old Ohio class and so forth. So we'll see about that. The Air Force is talking about. I mean, they're pursuing. I think they built 6 B-21 Raiders. Those are now undergoing testing. So that'll be another aspect of the nuclear triad for the United States, and so forth. The Air Force is also struggling on the land-based missile side as well. I don't have a clear sense of where they stand with that, but that seems to be beset by troubles as well. So we do. I mean, just as a show of resolve and capability. I mean, we really have a lot to do on the nuclear side as well. If we want to deter the Chinas and the Russias of the world, if China is really staging a nuclear breakout of this dimension, as it seems they are, at that point, simply showing it, making a show of competence, making a show of competence in the nuclear realm, that sends a message that we are still resolute, we are still determined to uphold our own purposes in the world. To me, I mean, I spend most of my time not in the nuclear realm, but in the conventional realm. To me, all those range arcs showing conventional arms that can reach out from China and make things very difficult on our ability to unify forces in the Western Pacific, from Hawaii, from the West Coast, from Guam, all of those places. That's really a deterrent to U.S. action in the Western Pacific on behalf of Taiwan or whoever our beleaguered partner might be. Think about what China can do using these conventional arms. The Clausewitz tells us that the value of the object governs the magnitude of the effort that you put into securing your political object, and the duration, how long you keep up the effort to essentially purchase that political object. And the competitors, you can manipulate your opponent's value of the object calculus. How much you want it determines how much you spend on it and for how long. Sort of a rate times time relationship. If China can make the point that the United States either cannot afford the magnitude of the military effort needed to prevail in the Western Pacific, or that it cannot sustain it long enough in order to win, at that point, that's a really strong statement to the White House. Hey, you either don't want it enough to spend all this, or you simply can't afford it because your force structure is in decline. at that point, especially if you can drive down the perceived value of Taiwan to the United States or the Philippine alliance or whatever the case may be, that's a big part of deterrence right there, is simply manipulating that relationship in the minds of the president and the president's advisors. It's a real head game, just like all of this stuff. But so I think that nobody wants a nuclear exchange, but I'll tell you what, there's a whole lot you can do short of the nuclear level in order to deter, coerce, and reassure. And that's sort of where we are. There's a lot going on in the United States to try to figure out how to fend off anti-access and area denial, puncture those envelopes. The Marine Corps and the Army are talking about stand-in forces that defy China's threats to drive us out of the Western Pacific. So scattering out along the island chain with missiles to try to pin China in. So that's sort of our reply to China right now on the conventional level. But yeah, this is I'm glad you all do what you do, because this deterrent stuff, it's really what we do every single day in the military and in the diplomatic apparatus as well, on both sides of the Pacific for that matter.
Jim, we had two questions that are similar. What cooperation do you see between Russia and China in various maritime areas, including in the Red Sea with respect to the Houthis? One of our commenters said that there's evidence of the GRU being in Yemen, but what cooperation between these Russia and China do you see in various maritime areas, including with the Houthis in the Red Sea, if any?
Yeah, they do. I think that's one thing our opponents do rather well, is kind of keep things muddled. I mean, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to and by the way, I do know classified work, so I'm not privy to any intelligence reports or whatnot out of the region. It's a matter of self-preservation. U.S. government who write a lot have to subject themselves to pre-publication review, and that would be the death of me. So I just stay away from it. I haven't seen a whole lot of sign of concerted Russian involvement. I have no doubt whatsoever that there are communications back and forth among the various capitals. That's some people are now calling a new axis. I hate the term, because that's a World War II thing. But this sort of entente among our opponents, I have no doubt there's some coordination going on, at least in terms of advising one another what to do and what not to do. So Russia also has been mostly exempt from Houthi attacks. In fact, I don't think there's been a single attack on a Russian vessel. It appeared that the one on a Chinese vessel was probably a mistake. I mean, this is, Iran, and it's always possible to mistake one nationality of vessel for another out at sea. There's probably just a mistake on the Houthis' part. I doubt they would have done that at all. But it does seem pretty clear that the Chinese basically took the Houthis behind the woodshed after the strike on the Chinese vessel, and that's where that system took shape. So, hey, if China's supplying munitions to Iran, and Iran is then cascading them to the Houthis and beyond, deliberately proliferating weapons around the Eurasian periphery, that's a good thing from China's standpoint. China is no friend to freedom of the sea, freedom of navigation, and it's the more it can make things hard on the United States and its allies in the waters that wash against the Eurasian shores. And that's a feature, not a bug from China's standpoint, and from Moscow's standpoint for that matter. I mean, that's kind of what Soviet strategy was all about in the late Cold War, but basically stiff arm NATO and Western and Allied forces, keep them away from Soviet shores. And during the 80s, of course, our maritime strategy announced, no, we're gonna spread the periphery on you. We're gonna threaten you around your periphery. We're gonna sink your submarine fleet and so forth. So there's sort of that challenge and reply dynamic that you see constantly going on in deterrence, coercion, and reassurance.
Jim, I'm gonna ask you one more question, which is, it's not out of left field, but it was recently came up. A Navy officer, admiral, talked about it in his testimony on the Hill, and that is the Chinese in the Arctic, and particularly the north, and trying to establish some kind of bases, because he made a point. He said, when the ice flows recede, that's the shortest distance to attack the continental United States. I'm just curious what you see.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. I think assuming that the Arctic becomes more navigable, which I think that the evidence seems kind of ambiguous to this point. But I mean, just projecting out there with the climate change forecast and whatnot. I mean, just assume that the Northwest Passage along the Canadian frontier, and then the the North Sea route along the Russian frontier. Those are it feels like those are going to become pretty usable. As far as the over the pole route, I guess we'll see. But but more navigable Arctic it's a game changer in many ways. I mean, think about Russia. Let's go back through Russian history in particular. Russia has a very different maritime geography. It's very hard to swing naval vessels or merchant ships from coast to coast. Found that in the Russo. We just covered the Russo-Japanese War this weekend here in the intermediate level course. When Russia wanted to reinforce its navy in the Far East in the fight against Japan, it had to send its Baltic fleet all the way around through the South Atlantic into the Indian Ocean, 18,000 miles of very difficult steaming with no maintenance, with little fuel and so forth. The opening the Arctic and open up North Sea route for Russia. I mean, that's a world historical event for Russia. So there's strategic advantages, and that this would be true for China as well. I mean, depending on where the port of origin is and the port destination is, say Rotterdam, pick your favorite European seaport. It's estimated that going through the Arctic cuts about 30 to 40% off the length of a voyage, and thus, much like being able to use the Red Sea today, cuts the cost of those voyages relative to China's or Russia's competitors. So we're getting our clocks clean. The United States we're getting our clocks clean in the Arctic right now. So especially with the icebreaker capability, Russia's going all out. China's built icebreakers. We have one. We briefly had 0 icebreakers this summer because our one working Coast Guard icebreaker had a fire on board and had to put back into port and take care of that. We have one. I think we're buying a commercial icebreaker, so we'll have 2. But I mean, Russia has a dozen, or maybe not dozens, but between 10 and 20 of these things, and that gives the ability to have that mobility over the pole. And so we'll I believe Russia, even as we speak, is experimenting with using a non ice hardened merchant vessel, in order to test out this northerly route, and then try to figure out exactly what's going to happen. But so in a sense, you're looking at a new strategic maritime theater coming into being, kind of as much as the Caribbean and the Gulf came into being as a strategic theater when the Panama Canal opened. Except that, interestingly, it's a shape-shifting theater. The ice pack presumably will expand and contract with the seasons, and that will be somewhat unpredictable, and it'll be unique. It'll be unique to watch what happens in the Arctic in the coming years. But so it's there's certainly something to be mindful of.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to turn it over to Alex as we run out of time, but that was a fascinating both lecture as well as conversation. My hat's off to you. Exactly what I wanted to lay out on the table, because these are serious issues which don't get a lot of attention. Go ahead, Alex. Let's conclude our session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Holmes, for sharing your views on what's going on right now in the Red Sea and elsewhere, and our deterrence or lack thereof. We have, in the next 2 weeks from today, we have actually 2 meetings, one at 10, one at 2. This is September 27. At 10 a.m., we have nuclear weapons and war, what happens when deterrence fails. This is with retired Brigadier General John Rose, who is the director at the Missouri State School of Defense and Strategic Studies. And then at 2 p.m., we have the future of arms control and nuclear deterrence with the Assistant Secretary, Mallory Stewart. She's Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. So both of these are September 27, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Hope you can make it to both. And thank you all for being with us today. And for those who have questions that were not yet answered, we'll save them and I will pass them on to Professor Holmes and see if he will be able to respond to those for us. All right. Thank you all and wish you all a great day today.